So much, Joshua, and hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here, and greetings from sunny LA. I wanted to thank you all for taking the time and to apologize for being fully online. It would have been really nice to be present in person to see everybody, but the storms we had out here a few weeks back kind of disrupted all of that, and here we are. This really is a treat for me to be on this side of it, having been a commenter for the center for the past few years, and it's really nice being the one causing the stress as opposed to being the one dealing with it. So thank you to my co-commenters for setting this all up. I really appreciate it. I wanted to speak today on a project that initially started with a paper for Professor David Carpenter's Magna Carta course way back before the plague, and that has since taken on a bit of a life of its own. Will hopefully end up in a journal at the end of this kind of phase. We're close, I hope. While it's gone through more than a few iterations, the core idea has always been to use the financial records of judicial activity as recorded in the fine rolls to quantitatively investigate the workings of the central royal common law courts in the immediate aftermath of the First Barons' War. The project is ongoing, and I would very much welcome thoughts or comments, especially in a few particular areas that I'll highlight a little later on in the talk that don't really have any ready explanation. And I would really appreciate any thoughts that anyone has on those. The contours of this project have evolved a little bit over the years. In one of its prior iterations, I had partially incorporated the air rolls into the study, but as most of the significant findings pertain to the bench, and as I really never seem to be able to make my mind up as to whether the heirs should count as part of the central royal courts or not, I've pared it back and expanded the dates under consideration to encompass the years of the minority of Henry III from the resumption of judicial activity and records, largely in 1218, a little bit in 1217. To immediately prior to Henry's declaration of majority at the start of 1227. The framing has two distinct advantages. First, it offers a glimpse into the direct aftermath of a period of extreme civil upheaval that resulted in Magna Carta and the permanent establishment of the bench, and that it encompasses a period of conciliar rule in the absence of an active king, which is extremely significant given contemporary legal philosophy and questions related to the rule of law in 13th century England. So essentially what we're doing here is asking questions related to the function and role of the bench, and through the bench of the overall royal judicial system through information contained in the fine rolls in a fairly limited span of time. Perfect. Okay, first I'd say a bit of background, but it's probably going to be a little bit more than that. Our scene is set in the direct aftermath of the First Barons' War. The Capetian attempt on the Kingdom of England has failed, and King John had died in 1216 in a fairly unpleasant fashion, leaving his young son Henry III on the throne as a minor, years away from assuming control, taking his full role as king. Rule was in the hands of a council, initially led by the peerless William Marshall. I'm a bit of a William Marshall fan, up until his death, and you can actually see the moment of his death more or less in the fine rolls as he's witnessing them essentially on his deathbed. The council's work was cut out with the disruptions caused by the recent conflict and with the political implications surrounding a period without an active king. But from a judicial standpoint, this is an extremely significant period, specifically for the development of legal institutions. The system of bifurcated courts established by King John had not survived his death. This was composed of the bench and the court quorum rege, which was a unique system in Europe at the time. The court quorum rege is more what one might expect as standard for the period. It consisted of a series of judges who would accompany the king on his perambulations and would ostensibly aid in his decision-making or rule in his view quorum rege, but that really depended on the activity of the king in question and how interested the king was in judicial action. The bench is the more unique court in this period. There's not really a comparison I can make to any other institutions to my knowledge. And it kind of grew out of the need for the kings of England to cross the channel in the late 12th and early 13th centuries to visit their holdings in Normandy, which was by no means a foregone conclusion that they would make this trip safely. So while their court might accompany them, there needed to be some judicial body still in England, which led to John's establishment of the bench, which, being John, he very quickly undermined in the first decade of the 13th century. Didn't completely cease its activity, but it was really de-emphasized in favor of the court quorum rege, ostensibly so John could exert more personal control over the judicial proceedings in the kingdom. But the issue here is that after John's death, the court quorum rege was essentially immediately disestablished, given that there was no king to sit in front of. leaving the bench, which had been permanently established, given proto-constitutional life in Chapter 17 of the 1215 Magna Carta, as the only central royal court in the kingdom, kind of taking on the responsibilities that the Cor Quorum Rege had up to that point. Chapter 17 of Magna Carta reads, "Common pleas are not to follow our court, but are to be held in some fixed place." This became Westminster. There's a bit of disagreement over whether this was envisioned as being in Westminster permanently, initially in 1215, but it very quickly became the de facto seat of the bench, and it really didn't move very much from there. Judicial activity had almost entirely ceased by the point we're starting here in 1218. After the war, the courts had really just been massively disrupted, and it was really not a foregone conclusion that they would be able to regain the status they had or the position they had beforehand, especially in the absence of John, who was really pushing the existence of these two bodies at various points. And so there's some real questions open as to the speed at which the courts resumed their judicial activity and the geographic distribution of this, which is really what I'm looking at in the study. The massive disruptions had led to a backlog of judicial cases and a huge pent-up demand for having these issues resolved in the courts. The council acts in 1217 to start addressing this, but the judicial activity really resumes in 1218 to its full degree. And this featured the commissioning of a general heir to tour most of the counties of the kingdom, which was divided in half between 1218 and 1221, largely to deal with this backlog. The heirs being visitations of the central royal courts to the localities, to the counties themselves, kind of circuits where we get this concept from. And the expectation that the resumption of judicial activity will be a gradual and halting one with geographic concerns is logical here, but as we'll see going forward, it's not what we actually find, which is absolutely fascinating. And there is a potential for the reverse of the Chapter 17 concerns, leading to the establishment of the bench in a fixed location. While it was difficult for litigants to track down the, kind of court, whatever iteration it was, while it was following John, there was potentially an issue with establishing a fixed court in Westminster, given that it would be geographically more inaccessible to some people in kind of further areas of the kingdom. So this study is going to focus on this extremely significant period and is going to hopefully give us a few insights into what the royal institutions of law look like going into the 1220s and going into the resumption of the king's power in 1227. 1228. So we have a little picture here that I'd like to highlight. It's from a later period, but we get so few opportunities to kind of have a visual interaction with these central royal courts that this is one of the few depictions I could find, and it includes the oak bench with a green cloth on top of it, which is something that I just find really, really interesting, and to actually kind of place what this might have looked like for a litigant coming forward to these courts. So just something to keep in mind as we discuss further, and it even includes some heraldry up top, which is a personal favorite. So we're going to have just a quick discussion of the justices of the bench, just to kind of set up what this might have looked like in terms of the actual personnel. By this point, judges tended to be great men in the old Curia Regis sense, but we're starting to see the beginning phases of the courts moving away from the old Curia Regis kind of large ecclesiastical figures, baronial figures, to a more professionalized court, which will become important as we get a little later on into the talk regarding payment methods for fines. There were a few holdovers from the prior administration, you could call it court of John, Eustace, Roger, and Joffrey. We'd expect to see more normally that we don't here. Is fairly significant. A few major ecclesiastical figures, and of course, you can see a couple of earls who are going to become very significant a little later on in the period. But what we're seeing here in this bench is the rise of the professionals. Martin of Padishal, Stephen of Seagrave, massive names, Robert of Lexington, and of knights participating in the actual hearings of these cases. Now, it should be pointed out that this was not even. These justices, some of them would have heard a number of cases, some of them only a few. I'm more just kind of putting this up there to give a characterization of the court. And because it really sets up the criticisms from the chroniclers, which were kind of fairly common in this period, Matthew Paris specifically. Uh, they complained that the new professional judges were men of low birth and perceived greed and venality, who were primarily concerned with raising revenue over the actual administration of justice. It's important to distinguish this from an actual accusation of corruption. There really was not a lot of sense that these justices were corrupt, just that they were maybe pushing financial exactions more than they had to be doing, which led to some popular discontentment, but which also could perhaps explain some of the variable payment schemes for fines that were made in this period. And the takeaway is really that the court is moving away from kind of this old model into this new identity at the same moment that there is no kind of overbearing kingly presence for the first time in decades, which I don't think is coincidental, certainly. But now that we've taken a bit of a look at the bench itself, we can actually dig into the fine rolls. So here's an example of the fines on the right here, and I'll just set up a little background on what the fines actually are before I go into how I'm breaking them down specifically. So fines are records of receipts for voluntary purchase initiating a royal action, as we see on the screen up here. In a legal context, these fines were made in order to bring cases that would normally have been heard by a lower court to the royal court system through the purchase of a writ, and different fines could be made at different points in the procedural process of a specific case. As a result, one single entry on the fine rolls can lead to multiple in the plea rolls, which are the judicial records themselves, but they're not really under consideration in this study. I looked at them in an earlier iteration, but it was kind of a peripheral benefit. And this leads to a disparity in the volume between the fine and the plea rolls, but it also leads to the fines presenting information in a more compact form, a little bit more easy to mine for information than the pleas are. Fines contain a number of insights into the actual favor that's being sought from the crown, who is seeking it, and what they paid for it. Actions could be initiated before the common law courts either through writs de cursu or writs de gratia, which is an important distinction. Writs de cursu were standard form documents made through the chancery that could be purchased at 6 pennies, 6d, and the function to initiate pleas at either the local county or the heir level, so lower level pleas. Whereas writs de gratia, by contrast, were paid for ex post facto through the exchequer and could be instead vary tremendously in cost, as opposed to the fairly flat level of the writs de cursu. This type is recorded in the fine rolls and will comprise the primary source material under consideration in this study. We can't really see writs de cursu, unfortunately, but they are reflected a bit through the writs de gratia. Writs de cursu are thought to strongly outnumber writs de gratia in the period, but the de gratia writs provide much more nuanced information, and both might be used in the process of a single case. De cursu writs to initiate and de gratia writs to remove to a central royal court later on. And in that way, the writs de gratia can reflect the initial unseen de cursu litigation, although it's a bit of a difficulty parsing that out. Now, these are recorded in the fines, and then since they have been brought into the Henry III Fine Rolls project, which I really can't speak highly enough of, and just a plug for it while I'm discussing the project, all of these fines have been translated, transcribed, and put on in a searchable format online, which makes it incredibly easy to run through quantitative studies like this, as opposed to actually having to trawl through the original documents themselves. So my methodological approach in this to kind of parse out the judicial fine rolls from the kind of wider body of fine rolls was to use this search function, specifically the term justice or justices, which is used in the formulation of where these cases are being sent to, justices of the bench, justices on air, et cetera. And then to go through and to cut out all of the hits that weren't directly related to the initiation or modification of judicial activity. This led to 316 different fines, 316 results, which is a fairly limited data set, but provides a wide-ranging view into the actual activity going on in this period, and is complete to our knowledge for the judicial activity 1218 to 1226. And we have an example, as I pointed out earlier, of these de gratia ones on the right, but we now can just jump into the actual data that has been mined from them. And I'm sorry if I'm a bit all over the place. I'm still getting my coffee. It's a little early. Okay, here is a really basic kind of breakdown of maybe the least interesting data that I'll present to you today. This is the number of bench entries per year and the progress that it has across the period. As you can see, it peaks early on and drops off significantly by the end, by 1226. It's not split evenly across the span. It is, again, a fairly small sample size, so I wouldn't read too much into this, but it is contextualized within a massive expansion of demand for common law legal services across the 13th century. So this can kind of be placed within conceptually a wider graph that would be trending upwards much more dramatically than this might suggest across the period. I don't have any ready explanation for this drop-off after 1220. It might make sense that it splits the heirs a bit. The peak in 1220 between the first and the second kind of iterations of the general heir, and therefore the heirs might have served to siphon off some litigation that otherwise might have come before the bench. Of course, it's a bit difficult to separate that from what might later come up through Rich de Gratia. But I'm open to any thoughts if anyone has any regarding that drop off. I really assume it doesn't have any kind of wider explanation outside of the prominence of the heirs in that period. But it is worth keeping in mind that as we get to the later, the data in the later end of this, that we really have very few to no entries. This is very much concentrated in the earlier period that we're speaking of here, which gives us the chance to come to an actual fine. There we go. Okay, so this is, I'm calling this the anatomy of a fine. This is a breakdown of a fairly typical fine from the period, just to show the information that I'm going to be taking out of this to present to you afterwards. It illustrates the wealth of information contained in even a single entry of the fine rolls. And I've highlighted my areas of analysis here, starting with the green, which refers to the county of margination. This is the county or the geographical area to which process is being sent that's at the center of the dispute and whose sheriff is kind of overseeing this. It serves as a useful indicator as to the geographic kind of locus of any of these specific concrete iterations of litigation. It can be used to provide a breakdown of the geographic distribution of the cases coming before the bench in this period. The yellow refers to the amount rendered for the purchase of a fine. This is very variable in the res gratia, as I had mentioned before. And in a specific instance in debt cases, it really is all over the place, which again does not lend itself to any ready explanation. But it's very useful in determining the amounts people are spending and what people are willing to give to have their cases heard, in this manner. The blue is what we'll refer to as the cause of action, which is, I know, a bit anachronistic, but I think is useful in breaking this information down. And it also refers to the secondary procedural aspects of a fine. That's why I have it broken down into two sections here. In this case, we're looking at opponent seeking to remove a case to a higher court, and it's focused on an issue of land, which has another geographic tag there, given where the land is. The gray refers to the branch of the royal courts to which the case was to be sent. All of these will be the bench, the justice at Westminster, but in the fine rules here, it will also refer to the justices in air or the itinerant justices regarding where they are in their perambulations. And other information is available, as you can see, especially pertaining to the identity of plaintiffs and to defendants, but that kind of social analysis is a little bit outside of what I'll be doing here. There is room for a breakdown of the actual specific litigants making use of the courts here and what that might say about the reach of the royal justice system throughout society. So we'll be jumping around a little bit to look at these different areas, but we can just jump right into it with the causes of action. So there we go here. Okay, so a little bit of a discussion of what I mean by causes of action. It's a bit of an imprecise label, and again, a bit of an anachronistic one, but it refers to the underlying and animating causes behind a case, the issues it revolves around. It will align with the original writ, and as a result, it's the best reflection of the unseen writs de cursu that comprise the bulk of the judicial writs of the period that we have access to. A few examples here of what it might look like in some random cases. Concerning 60 acres of land, summoning the prioress, concerning customs and services. These are, in my kind of breakdown of these would be land, this would be debt, and then the last one would have to do with fees, customs, services, etc. A lot of these are related to each other. They really all revolve around land to a degree. Most of them do, but it is possible to break them up into separate categories. So just kind of an indication of what they might look like in this next slide, which takes us, this doesn't want to change, there we go, to a breakdown of what these causes of action look like across the period under consideration. By far and away, land is the most common, as I kind of alluded to in the prior slide. And this tracks with Heim's claim that the vast majority of cases in the first half of the 13th century would be concerned with land in some way. Really, if anything, you can kind of think of that as comprising more of the pie chart than maybe is here, because I've kind of separated off other causes of action where I can to try and show as much distinction as possible. And that kind of points to the intrinsic difficulty in properly delineating these causes of action. But my response has been to roughly rely on the proximate cause behind the case. Therefore, a plea of customs and land is separated from a plea in land, given the emphasis on the customary aspects of it, even though the underlying cause might be the same. But it's perhaps surprising that debt is the second most common in this period. It's the oldest of the contractual obligations, but it really comprises an outsized section of what I'll be looking at, considering what we might see later on in bench activity. And here we can, in fairly frequent number of entries, differentiate that from actual underlying land claims. And it's also a bit interesting to see entries related to violence, which would become much more closely associated with the Court Quorum Rege after its reconstitution in 1234. I think this is largely a function of the fact that there wasn't really anywhere else for this to go during this period. This was the highest central royal common law court, and therefore was bringing in some cases that might otherwise be heard in venues that are more well suited to that consideration. But it really illustrates that the court is developing, and it's at a developmental stage here in terms of the businesses coming before it. It's taken on a bit of the responsibility of the Court Quorum Rege. It's still largely concerned with land and with debt cases that are going to be, I think, dying out, not really necessarily dying out, but lessening as we go forward in time. And then we have a few more categories here that are smaller. Presentment and vowson related to appointments and churches, which I know there are different causes of action, but I'm kind of looping them together here to just show what the court's doing. Custody, the robbery of violence that I'd referred to, and dower as well. This will take us to a consideration of the secondary fines, which I'm kind of referring to as being more procedural fines as opposed to the initial causes of action I was just discussing. These are entries meant to modify, remove, or challenge existing cases. They can be used to determine the extent to which the bench acted as a court of review, as opposed to a primary court or a court of first instance. Primarily, these are going to be attaint, pone, and removal. Removal is consistently referred to as being distinct from pone in the actual language being used in the entries, but it functions similarly. So we'll really just focus on the pone and the attaint. Pone is an instruction to transfer a plea brought before a lower court by another writ to a royal court at a specifically designated time. As you see, the attaint allows a litigant to challenge a jury's verdict, and in so doing to continue a plea. This really reflects the evolving role of the court, as opposed to a court of first instance to a court of review in the absence of the Court Quorum Rege in the way I described. And it actually gives us some really interesting indications as to the evolution of the pone across the 13th century. So what I've done here is I've broken down the major secondary fines, which are the majority of bench activity at this point, as we can see on the left here. And again, it's a bit difficult to distinguish secondary from non-secondary entries, given that these entries would have different stages along the procedural process, kind of their life through the court system. So again, if anything, the non-secondary cases should be a smaller percentage of the overall whole compared to the secondary ones. I strongly identifies the bench as a secondary court in the period, and the number of writs does grow overall consistently in line with the massive expansion of royal justice. Given these bookend dates, the rise should perhaps be a bit more level, but it does kind of lead us on to the section on the right here, which shows us the percentage of overall litigation comprised of writs pone and how that evolves across the period. I'm using data from later on in the 13th century, through David Carpenter's Between Magna Carta and the Parliamentary State here to kind of juxtapose this. But we do see that in the period under consideration, 1218 to 1226, writs pone composed about 43% of the overall litigation coming through the bench, which can be contrasted with the earlier period, 1207 to 1208, which is higher at 47, and especially with the later period, 1256 to 1257 at 13%. Now, it's worth considering here that the percentages in terms of the overall number of writs are a bit skewed. I'm only looking at the 316 here as opposed to the 70 smaller before, and at the later period, the 462. But the overall takeaway, I think, is pretty significant here, that writs pone were dropping off massively across the century, and that we see that happening live in this period. This is really interesting, especially in regards to the resurrection of the court quorum rege in the 1234 and in the 1230s. Later in the century, there were allegations of favoritism that led in no small part to the Second Barons' War. There's a perception that the courts were especially favorable to certain litigants who had kind of an in with the king or who were more prominent, and that they were getting access to justice in a way that an average layperson might not be able to the same extent. And it's interesting how this might interact with the writ pone, which definitionally is going to be bringing a case up from a lower court as opposed to perhaps a more expensive writ that would have brought it to the bench as a court of first instance. There's an argument to be made that pones might correlate to some degree with less influential litigants, and if that's the case, this might provide fairly straightforward evidence of the difficulty in which those litigants might have in accessing the court system in the first place. So it's potentially an indicator of those complaints of a royal favoritism. But again, I'm very open to arguments or thoughts on that, given that it's a bit of a stretch that pone might have shown too much of that kind of class distinction, something worth keeping in mind. And that's really all I wanted to discuss regarding the procedural aspect of these fines. It will kind of take us to a discussion of the payments that were made per fine. Now that we've kind of looked at the animating causes and procedural modifications of these judicial fines, we can turn to the actual funds rendered by litigants for the making of the fines themselves. And I've got a couple more graphs here. Most immediate takeaway here is that the large majority are for 1/2 mark. It's moving towards a standardized level that we see happen later on in the period, where 1/2 mark is very common in terms of a payment to be rendered for this, but it's not quite at that stage yet. It's still a number of payments being rendered at 1 mark and a number being rendered at a portion of the debt, which is something that I really want to discuss after this section. There are still a few non-monetary payments, largely taking the form of 1 palfrey, a riding horse, or in a couple of instances measured in tons of French wine, which I always find to be a fun way to make a payment for the initiation of one of these cases, usually from merchants. There are a range of payments, though, that could be made, even given the relative early stage of standardization under 1/2 a mark, 20 shillings as well, we see in some instances. And this information can also be compared with broader data from both David Carpenter's work and from Tony Moore's in the same book regarding fines made later on in the century and kind of across the entire period. It should be noted that the fines from 1256 to 1257 were made specifically to commission the assizes, but this is still kind of relevant for our information here and for a comparison to the fines I'm looking at in the 1220s, late 1210s. It indicates the growing standardization at 20 shillings, 1/2 mark, and 1 mark. As we can see across the period, the percentage of overall cases that feature these payments is growing. And this is largely growing consistently. And this is happening at the expense, of course, of the less standardized payments, the others in terms of shillings, non-monetary payments, payments over 5 marks, etc. So it really kind of places the court in the same way that the actual underlying causes of action did in this kind of developmental period, moving towards what we might expect to see later on in the century, but not quite there yet. That takes me to what is perhaps the most interesting and in some ways confusing aspect of this study, which is the degree of different payment variability in payments that can be made, specifically in instances of debt. And what I've done here to really kind of illustrate this is provided three examples in as compact temporal and geographical space as possible: May, June 1218, in Middlesex, Essex, and again in Middlesex. These are all cases in debt. These are very similar cases, but the payments being made for them are massively divergent. So first, we have a very standard payment you might expect to see out of any of these fines. One mark being made for a case of debt, and these are really debt enforcement. Somebody's saying, you know, this person owes me this much money, bringing it to the court to have them pay the person. So 1 mark is being paid for a debt of 8 marks and 6 shillings. I've kind of translated or made all this into kind of the lowest common denominator of pence, denarius, pennies. So we can really see the percentages of the overall debt the payments are comprising. This payment was made outside of the actual debt under recovery. It's just straightforward. I'm giving you a mark. Please recover these 8 marks, 6 shillings for me. And that's 11.8% of the overall debt that's being paid. But again, not out of the actual debt itself, which is what we see in these other 2 instances, not for, but of. So in the next case, we have a 50 shilling payment out of a 24 mark, 7 shilling debt. So fairly similar at 15.3%. The difference here is that this payment would have been made out of the first monies of the recovered debt. This suggests that there was, you know, very much a kind of impetus for the court to recover the debt so they could receive their payment. But it's not that divergent from what you might see being rendered outside of from the first monies formulation. 50 shillings could be a rate at which writ for a case in debt, or for a plea in debt, or for a plea in any of these other causes of action could be purchased normally. Which really kind of leads us to how strange this third payment form is. A third of a £60 debt is being offered out of the first monies to be recovered, which of course is a 33.3% payment out of the debt. But in terms of real actual funds being rendered, this is much, much, much higher in degree of magnitude, really, from the other payments that are being offered in cases of debt. And that really doesn't lend itself to any ready explanation. If a litigant could make a flat payment of a mark, or even take a mark out of the debt to be recovered, to initiate a plea in debt for even up to £60, why would one choose to instead offer a £20 payment out of that overall debt to be recovered, unless there was some kind of advantage being offered out of doing so? So this is something that I'm really open to thoughts on. I've not had any real way of solving this, and a number of the people I've spoken to have offered some very interesting perspectives on it, but nothing conclusive. Some possible explanations: it could be related to concerns over revenue maximization by judges. First monies payment could encourage a faster process, in the same way that a writ de gratia might encourage a plea to make its way through the system faster, more speedily than a writ de cursu might do. It could reflect the same logic, therefore, the streamlined process. It could also reflect concerns potentially over merchant transactions, as seen in litigation that took place under the reign of Edward in the later portion of the century, in the hopes that merchants might need these issues resolved more speedily than other litigants might do. This could reflect an interest in that. It could also reflect individual negotiations with the exchequer, and it could perhaps reflect some degree of this variability. The writs de gratia were already fairly variable, but that doesn't necessarily answer specifically why litigants were willing to make so much higher of a payment than they might otherwise need to do. Perhaps it might also then be explained by a lack of information on behalf of litigants. It could be something as simple as the fact that the payments, the fines that were being rendered by litigants for these pleas were not widely publicized, and word of mouth perhaps didn't really spread the indication of what payment you could make in the lowest end to be able to interact with the royal courts in the way we might expect it to do. And so it could just be something as simple as the fact that the litigants did not know that they could have simply made a 1 mark or a half mark flat payment, as opposed to offering a percentage of the debt. The practice is not nearly as common later in the period, but I have to believe that something is going on here, and my assumption is that it is related to the speed of the actual resolution. But it's the big question mark in this study, certainly, and something that I'm very open to thoughts on. Here we have a breakdown, and this one's a little bit bigger, and I apologize for the nature of these county listings. A breakdown of the margination of the fines, and therefore the geographic locus to which they would be associated with. It illustrates the various levels of interaction with the bench on a county basis. Some fines will record multiple counties, and these have been counted separately, so there will be more entries when you add all this up than the 316 I'm working with. But what the real takeaway from this is that the vast majority of counties have some interaction with the bench, even across this fairly small period. There's only a handful that no entries come from. And of course, we're dealing with a very small data set, so you can't read too much into that necessarily. But it is worth keeping in mind that this might not necessarily reflect what we see in population levels from across the period. Now, we really only have, as I will show in this next slide, population estimates from the 1290s. So we're looking a little bit later in the century in order to provide this kind of juxtaposition, but I think it's still useful. These are the Broadberry et al. Estimates, and most immediately noticeable is the highest number of fines tend to come from the most populous counties, with the very significant exception of Yorkshire, which is another open kind of question mark here as to why Yorkshire is not following this pattern. But we see the correlation here break down a bit when it comes to the lowest end of the fines and entries in this period. Again, a few number of entries for these actual counties, and the lowest on the left here, the lowest end, I have Cumberland and Westmoreland because they're both tied at one entry here, whereas the ones below, Lancashire, Leicestershire, Rutland, and Shropshire, are all at 0 entries. So, again, not necessarily too much we can take out of that, but if you look at the population estimates, there really is not all that much overlap. You see Rutland appearing there. Cornwall needs to be kind of contextualized there, given the stannary workers are excluded, so it likely has a much larger population than it would be listed at. This kind of information here, but it doesn't really go too far in explaining why it is that we might see that kind of breakdown at the lower end of the spectrum here. It is interesting, I think, that at the higher level, there is that degree of correlation. It's logical, but perhaps not a foregone conclusion, given the disrupted state of the judicial system at the time. And it's worth remembering that there are significant kind of geographic concerns that are intrinsic in kind of putting these counties in relation to each other as well, given that the court is standard at Westminster. The engagement with the bench largely tracks along population lines, as far as we can tell, with a bit of the asterisks around Yorkshire and around the counties at the lower end. But I really do not think that is, as I had mentioned before, something that we could assume before looking at this information. I think, if anything, the assumption would be that we would see less of a correlation, that we might see more of a geographic one, which I will get to in the next slide. Now that we've had a chance to investigate whether population levels could account for geographic distribution of fines, we can ask the same question over physical distance. And I've included a map here, which might be more useful to those of us who didn't grow up in the UK, as opposed to those who did. This really put it in perspective for myself, getting a chance to actually plot this out. What I've done here is gone through to take 4 counties with a fairly similar population level, given the 1290 population estimates, and a fairly standard level of entries in the fines, 8 entries for Wiltshire and Northumberland, and 9 for Devonshire and Northamptonshire, to really kind of provide a geographic indication of whether the distance of litigants was preventing a level of litigation that one might expect given population from reaching Westminster. As we can see, Westminster is highlighted in blue down there, of course, London. And as we can see, just really given this visual representation here, litigants did not seem to be put off by the geographic distance necessary for them to reach Westminster. You can see this really, really obviously in the Wiltshire-Northumberland comparison, but perhaps even more so in a comparison of Wiltshire to Devonshire, Northumberland to Devonshire. Given that they have almost exactly the same population, they only have a difference in 1 entry, but the geographic distance to Westminster is really significant. That this did not seem to put a damper on the litigation that came in is perhaps the most interesting and surprising takeaway, I think, of my investigation of these records. we really can see that litigation in both population and geographic levels was neither affected by the regional nature of the conflict that had preceded this period, the First Barons' War, or affected by these kind of population and geographic concerns that differentiate these counties. But it does kind of answer the initial question we're asking over the Chapter 17 concerns, given that the fixed location might cause some difficulties for people in the more remote areas in a way that the kind of semi-air-like perambulations of John might have served to rectify. And it answers that question conclusively by telling us that both in a geographic and in a population sense, that the resumption of litigation was immediate and widespread in the aftermath of the war and across the period prior to the resumption of Henry III's, or to the assumption of Henry III's authority in 1227. So that was kind of all over with the breakdown of the fines themselves, but we can derive a few conclusions from this that I think are fairly useful. As I said in the prior slide, the first is that the rapid and geographically widespread resumption of judicial activity before the bench in the immediate aftermath of the First Barons' War is immediately evident in the investigation of these fines themselves. It does point to the enduring success of Chapter 17 of Magna Carta. The widespread interaction with the bench indicates the complaints over following the court quorum rege were solved, and that the bench could address the really backlog along with the errors of judicial activity kind of been built up in this period after the war successfully and without causing any further disruptions to the judicial process. We can see beginnings of later trends towards standardization in the fine costs almost immediately here, and this kind of is something that is more evident when we're looking backwards from later on in the century than perhaps looking forwards from 1218. But it's instantaneous that this process begins. It speaks to the role of the bench and the change in the role of review of the bench. It largely occupied a role of review as a court of review in this period. And it does reflect questions over the drop-off of pony litigation and whether that might reflect evidence of royal favoritism and the kind of initiation of that process that would lead to further conflict at this early period. There are a few open questions, as I've pointed out here, related to the overall number of entries and why they dropped off by the later end of the period, to Yorkshire itself, kind of bucking this trend of the population of a county matching the actual number of fines coming before the bench. And of course, that great question over the fines and debt regarding the variant payment schema and what that might reflect and possible explanations as to why litigants would be willing to pay so much more for the initiation of fines and debt. And this kind of leads me into this theory that I'm very inelegantly referring to as my kind of bureaucratic theory of the central royal institutions across the period, which is a bit of reflection of my doctoral research. So I don't want to necessarily get too far into that just yet. But one of the things I'm looking at in my doctoral thesis is a juxtaposition of the periods in which King Henry III later on in the century is present in England versus when he's absent, usually in Gascony, and how that's reflected in the actual litigation in front of the court quorum rege and the bench. But in putting the study together, I really realized that we're offered a much wider window and perhaps one with a clearer view into what the court system might look like in the absence of an active king across this period, given that the king is a minor and doesn't actually have the ability to kind of inject himself overly much in the judicial proceedings in the period. And it really begs an interesting question. There's a massive demand for this central royal jurisdiction across the 13th century. We can see the fines, the pleas being brought, expanding across the entire period. But I think the question that begs is the degree to which that's a function of the crown having essentially a monopoly on kind of higher jurisdiction, given the feudal system and its operation. There's the F word, right? And how that might work. There's nobody else in the lay sense who could kind of occupy this central higher royal court role than the crown. But it's a bit of a separate question as to whether the crown was necessary for that versus the king being necessary as an individual for that process to go on. And I think what we see here fairly conclusively is that the king wasn't necessary in an actually involved proactive sense for the successful operation of a judicial system. It was functioning, as far as we can tell, very efficiently, given that we've seen the geographic and kind of population distribution here and the amount of revenue that it brought in, and the activity of the justices in making sure that it did continue to bring in that revenue. And I think the natural assumption here is that judicial activity would, in fact, falter in the absence of a king. And that might have, in fact, been the case if we were looking at, Louis IX or Frederick II. But considering the personality of Henry III a little bit later after he's assumed his majority, and given that his interest as a king tends towards perhaps, more issues of faith and family, and his enduring interest in interior decoration as opposed to what one might expect to be a more standard, interest in law, administration of justice, which were really kind of at the core of the contemporary political theory, the perceptions of the role of the king, what the king should be doing. I mean, you can even look at, the dictum of Kenilworth, look at Bracton, look at any of these kind of perceptions of the king as the font of justice and kind of the head of justice. But it really might not already by this point, and before Henry III's kind of more ambivalent interaction with his justice system, it might not even have been necessary for a king, like we might expect with John or with Edward, to be at the helm of this for it to operate efficiently, which is something I think very fascinating relating to those earlier questions regarding the rule of law and the extent to which the king would then later be subject to these courts. We see this in 1234 at the Council of Gloucester, developing in this earlier stage, and the role that these courts occupied in society in terms of being able to bring in all of these kind of pent up, backed up demand of litigation for litigation without actually needing the kind of majesty and persona of the king himself to lend it that gravitas and that social kind of cash for it to fulfill its role as kind of the highest court and the center of judicial activity in the realm. Some future extensions of the study that are possible could relate to the actual heirs. I did use the heir rolls initially to hopefully provide a bit of juxtaposition into the actual jurisdictional contours compared with the bench. My knowledge on the procedural workings of the heirs is a little bit more limited than it is to the bench, so I cut that out as not being quite as pertinent, but I think there is some room to bring the heirs back in. There's room, as I kind of mentioned earlier in the talk, for a social analysis of the litigants. And then I've had some interesting feedback to this as well, that there might be a possible reflection of road networks and kind of travel networks in the kingdom as to where this litigation was coming in from, and that could perhaps reflect some of the greater variability in regards to the counties at the lower end of the population spectrum. And also the idea that some of the litigation brought might have actually been offensive litigation, not necessarily meant to address an underlying issue, but to kind of put out a social or political opponent and force them to kind of go through a process they otherwise might not have to have done, using the court system in a way in which it perhaps was not initially intended to be, and whether we can kind of see any of that reflected in the actual litigation here before the bench itself. But that's about the 45-minute mark, and I have a couple more interesting entries in case there's a bit more time that are worth looking at. I'll leave a fun one up here in the background. But otherwise, thank you all so much for your attention, and I'm open to any questions, comments that you might have.
Great, thank you very much for the insightful talk, Doug. Yes, we'd like to now open to questions. Yes, Neil.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I was late. I was supervising. Just in relation to the question about the proportion of the debt.
Yes.
I noticed that the one that is 33%, the debt is over 14,000 pence, whereas the other two are both under 4,000. Is it possible that has some effect?
Very much so. I think that might be where the individual negotiations with the Exchequer might be a compelling argument here. It could be that there was a bit more of a impetus, of course, at a larger sum like this for its recovery in a speedier fashion, and therefore the litigant might have been willing to make a greater fine to see that kind of litigation initiated. But I do wonder, because I think the question there, the real core question, and I need to dig maybe a little bit later into the error roles and to the bench roles as well to look into this, would be the extent to which it was even an option at a higher kind of price point like that for a litigant to bring a fine at a flat fee. My assumption is that the counsel might have had some kind of degree of control over that. Maybe it might have pushed the plaintiff in one direction or another in terms of the amount being rendered, but there's no ready indication that there was a cutoff point as to the actual debt under consideration that would have brought it into that kind of percentage payment scheme, if that kind of answers your question.
Thank you. And just on the distance point, of course, I suppose there's also might be a question about travel by sea. It just occurred to me with Northumberland that the road network and distance, it might to some extent be a question of time, and there may be places that are well connected with London by sea.
That's fascinating. Absolutely. We'll make a note of that. Yeah, sea networks as well, certainly. Travel in general, it'd be nice to kind of bring together some research and kind of an indication over the ease of travel from the more distant points of the realm and how that might correlate to the population levels. But thank you very much. That's something I had not even remotely considered. It's so easy to kind of forget that sea travel was an option during this period as well. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Yeah, Chris.
Thanks. Hi, Doug. Thanks for that. Enjoyed that. I'm sure I've discussed this before, but just thinking again, like Neil was, about this question of the percentage payments for debt recovery. I mean, what are people paying for in that category, or that and the other category on the slide with the 3 examples? Are they paying for writs in the same sense as some of the other actions? Are they obviously either secondary writs or the primary writs, to use your categories? The example here on the screen doesn't mention a writ as such. So I just in those particular cases, what are people paying for, and is it something differs from the generality of fines that you've been looking at, and could that help us understand what you get for your money, if you like?
Sure. They're paying, I think, most directly for the recovery of these funds. So let me bring this back up. I've just ruined my PowerPoint. There wasn't. The debt cases in my research related to the error earlier indicated that these cases in debt were almost exclusively brought before the bench. I didn't have a complete data set there, so it's not ironclad conclusion, but it did seem that there was something particular about the bench that attracted specifically this type of debt litigation. It does not seem there's a degree of fact finding as to whether the debt was owed. Presumably there would have been some verification, but these really do seem to be concerned with the recovery of the debt. You make the payment and you have the court then say, okay, this money is owed. You have to come present this day, render the funds. In terms of what the actual payments are purchasing there, a number of them did, and I'll go back and review the actual specific breakdown of secondary to primary, but a number of these did seem to be primary in the sense that they would have been brought to the bench as a court of first instance, which I think might to some degree reflect that question over why the bench was being used to a degree over the heirs, perhaps expertise, perhaps some degree of speed that would be associated with the fact that they were stationary and they weren't having to then send the process back, go to all these counties, et cetera. But it's kind of a meandering answer, but it really doesn't answer this core question that I think you pointed to as well, over just the motivations for what might lead somebody to make that higher payment, which is not something that, as much as I've considered this and looked at all these different possibilities, it's not something that I can come to any easy answer to. Perhaps there was some degree of discussion with the justices of the bench themselves, and maybe that reflects their expertise to a degree, but really just the purchase of the recovery which kind of is that same argument over, potential. I think you had raised the point over the merchants' concerns and the potential need in certain areas of business or certain areas of the country for. Sorry about that, for these cases to be expedited.
Yeah, you didn't.
This is perhaps parasitic on what Chris said, but I think it's arguable that in the bench, debt is not a completely conceptually stable category at this time anyway, and therefore I think you're probably right that there's an argument that what you're suing for will determine what you get, but what you have to pay. The only other thing I can think of, is it possible that if you can show that you are a debtor to the king, you will pay a lower price for his quote marks help in enforcing your debt, because he already has a financial stake in you recovering.
That's very interesting. In regards to the second portion of that, given that we're in kind of the period of the council, and they certainly were fairly active in representing the king's interests, I'm sure they had a concern in that. I would be a bit surprised to see at this stage a reflection of business specifically related to the king. There was some degree of postponement that we saw in business across the minority that the king really needed to be of age in order to deal with until he came of age in 1227. But I can't actually recall, and this is just off the top of my head, any of the debt entries that I looked at in these fine rules relating to the king. I think they were all private litigants. Mm-hmm. And then to your first point, yes. And we see the standardization of these debt cases later on in the century. These variable payments really start to drop off. We start to see much more standardized payments being made for debt in the same way we might expect them to be made for other fines. So I do think, yes, it does reflect the kind of early stage, and all of this is really at an early stage. I mean, if you think about the idea that the system really only came into being or started to become into being with Henry II, really within a few generations of the period we're looking at, and these kind of massive political and legal upheavals that we're seeing in the 1215 to 1217 period, we might expect to see even more disruption than we do. And I think that is another interesting takeaway in relation to less the causes of action themselves, but to the population and geographic information yielded by the study.
Thanks. That's really interesting.
Are there any other questions? I wonder if you could talk a bit about the extra slides you prepared for us today. Yeah.
Absolutely happy to. Are they still, they're showing on the screen? I think I've ruined my well set up. Okay, perfect. Balance between the two. So in this first entry, this was just very fun because we actually see a specific instance of a merchant, in this case of the King of France, giving French wine for the summoning of a debt case. It's potentially an indication of what we've been speaking about, of the need of specific members in different roles in society to have debt resolved more quickly than they might otherwise have to. The argument could at least be made that Herbert French here, in his 2 tons of good French wine, it's fantastic, is offering this non-monetary payment, in this case of debt, to potentially even out of his own stock, I'm assuming, to expedite this case as quickly as possible, given his need to continue his transactions. And it's for 10 marks, so we do see as well the kind of variability in the actual amounts that people are willing to litigate for the recovery of. And we see the summoning of another. I just completely missed that second part. Excuse me. We see William de Manville as well summoned for a much greater sum, and we see an earl summoned as well for a smaller sum to the same degree. So this one I kind of included not only because it was a little bit fun with the wine, but also because it really is a great kind of highlighting of where this isn't really adding up, where it's not really making sense. Of course, £30 being a very large sum, 10 marks being a much smaller one, but the same actual degree of, in this case, it's not money, but the same actual degree of value being rendered for these debts to be called in. And, we do see some fairly powerful individuals, members of society here being called into the courts, which, if nothing else, does show that in the absence of a king, the authority of the judicial system wasn't really questioned. And I don't think we necessarily assume it to be. The system had developed to a good degree by this point, was fairly robust. But it is an interesting reflection of how prominent members of society could be in order to be brought up for large sums of money with the expectation that they would render it. And of course, he has pledges for the fine we see at the bottom here as well in London. Kind of harks back to geographic considerations and perhaps our travel networks regarding where these merchants might actually be operating and where we might expect them to be seen. And the other one, this was just fun. Cornwall, Adam Blunt of Stratton gives the king 2 marks for having before the justice of Westminster the battle that has been waged over 200 lumps of tin, which Adam says he's mined. So we have 2 marks being rendered for a battle over non-monetary value, 200 lumps of tin. And I haven't the slightest what a lump of tin would actually be defined as at this point, if it's a standard weight or measurement or not. If anyone has any insights into that, please do let me know. But it's also a reflection here over perhaps the more geographically variable, in the same sense of the last one, impetus for litigation to arise. We have, merchants we might expect to see in London. We have mining we might expect to see in Cornwall. There are some other kind of regional industries we might expect to see in other portions of the country. But especially for people whose research I think is a little later on, seeing some cases where people are fighting battles over lumps of tin is always a fun and kind of interesting insight into the period. But, to kind of continue that rumination, also one that reflects just how important the kind of standard of making use of the royal courts was becoming at this point. That's something that would ostensibly have been more local in scope in an earlier period, which now is being brought into the central courts in London, and is showing the extensive reach of the courts across the realm in this period. But also just the lumps of tin in the wine stood out as being more exciting than the usual debt and land cases that had popped up very frequently.
You might wonder whether that relates to a case that presumably had begun in a lower court. Is this a case of removal? I mean, is this the Cornish County Court or something, or would that be stated if that was the case, do you think?
It would have been stated if that was the case. At least it should have been. So the indication is that this is being brought directly to the bench, which I suppose is interesting in and of itself, given the kind of remote nature of Cornwall, that we see it in 1220 with the heirs kind of in the midst of the heirs. But yeah, no, that as well. And that kind of harks back in the same way to the fact that the population estimates that we have for Cornwall are a little bit off with the exclusion of the stannery workers. It could be that there was, a larger degree of litigation versus population level, but Cornwall specifically, given its kind of mining nature and its more remote nature, might have reflected had we had more of that information. And how do we compare it with the heir rolls, which I think Cornwall and a few of the other more atypical counties are particularly of interest in seeing how much they did interact with the heir in comparison with the central court.
Well, if there are no further questions, please join me in thanking Doug for his fantastic talk. We will be back in the law faculty next Tuesday for Dr. Fleur Stolker's talk, and we'll be sending out an email with the details in the next few days. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thanks again, Doug.
Thank you so much, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
See you soon.